On today's World Insight, Iran nuclear deal talks on pause. What will it take to keep the Vienna negotiations back on track? Could the conflict over Ukraine hold negotiations hostage? And the Ukraine crisis has sent ripples over global security, a stress test on the world order. How does it affect the military postures of China and the U.S.? A frank exchange with Chinese and American security experts. Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin with the 11-month-long Iran nuclear deal talks in Vienna recently until last Friday's announcement that they are now on pause. According to European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, a pause is needed over what he called external factors. On Saturday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov sought U.S. guarantees that sanctions on Russia over the Ukraine conflict should have little effect on Russia's trade with Iran. But the U.S. thumbed down such a demand. France, Britain, and Germany said in a joint statement on Saturday nobody should seek to exploit the Iran nuclear deals to obtain assurances that are separate to the deal. That is a quote according to them. Iran and the U.S. did say they are willing to overcome hurdles to a final agreement, but will they? Amid the pause in the Vienna negotiations, what will it take to keep the Iran nuclear deal back on track? Could the conflict over Ukraine hold the negotiations hostage, or actually lack of determination and willingness from Washington? For direct answers, let's turn to our panelists. I'm joined in Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, professor at Tehran University. In London, Sahil Shah, policy fellow at the European Leadership Network. In Beijing, Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. A lot of things are going on parallel with one another in our world today. With Russia-Ukraine conflict, Professor Marandi, how do you see the Iran nuclear deal and its future potential?
Well, it is an important deal, and I must point out that the two countries that helped the most to bring us to where we are now are China and Russia. Of course, recently the Russians have made demands to the United States which can create complications, which the Iranians are working to solve. But if the nuclear deal is ultimately revived, I think that can play an important role for regional stability. And the intrusive inspections that the IAEA carried out in Iran for years, since the signing of the nuclear deal, before Trump tore it, and then later on when the Iranians decreased their presence in the country, proved that the Iranian nuclear program was completely peaceful. We have to keep in mind that until recently, when the Iranians decreased their commitments to the IAEA because of US and European actions, the Iranians had the most intrusive inspections regime in the world for years. So if it is revived, I think it is a good sign, especially under these circumstances that we have in Europe.
Under the circumstances, very complex circumstances, Mr. Shah, tell me more about, from the Europeans' perspective, how willing are the Europeans now ready to sign this deal? After all, earlier it was the U.S. withdrawal from the deal that has made a lot of things much more complicated until today.
Absolutely. Well, it should be noted that the European Union is the coordinator of the JCPOA and has been coordinating the negotiations over the last 11 months. The EU has really held the pen on this and has been doing a lot of shuttle diplomacy back and forth between the US, Iran, and also amongst the other countries that sit around the table at the Joint Commission. It's extremely important to Europe that the JCPOA is revived as soon as possible. I think the Europeans, here emotions are high over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and having another transatlantic security threat, such as Iran's growing nuclear program, is just something that isn't acceptable to them. And because they've come so far and really reached a text which only has a few items still in brackets left to negotiate, which are actually really up to now just the US and Iran to finalize, Russia's latest curveball of asking for demands related to its trade and relationship with Iran and its ability to cooperate with Iran in multiple ways is indeed shocking, and the reason why everybody has gone on a break right now.
At this point, we are looking at things with a totally different angle now. Huge geopolitical changes and shifts, including the latest Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, Professor Yang, how do you see the urgency of parties to come together at this point?
It's a very good question. I think China shares with the European Union that it should be revive the deal, Iran nuclear deal as soon as possible, simply because another geopolitical crisis has been going on. And if the international community failed to deal with the nuclear issue on Iran, then we will face another crisis, a geopolitical crisis terribly. Therefore, now we need to make a joint efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal with all means, and of course with all flexibilities from all the parties.
Now, here's an interesting thing, Professor Morandi, that if you look at the Western media, it seems to shape things as if it was the Russians' demand now during the time of Russia and Ukraine conflict that has led to the collapse of the current progress of the Iran nuclear deal. However, if you look at the Russian media, the party would say it is merely the U.S. reluctance to cooperate at this point and using the conflict as an excuse for not moving forward that has dragged everything down. Now, Professor Morandi, as a party, one of the most important two parties, I guess, within this JCPOA, tell me more about your thoughts on these very different perspectives or framing.
Well, I would like to make a distinction between Enrique Mora, the EU coordinator, and the E3. The E3 has played a very negative and destructive role throughout, and they've been dragging their feet along with Americans like children for 3 months, actually for 11 months. And step by step, the Iranians have been forced to take their rights literally out of the mouths of these countries. So these countries, under no circumstances did they want to implement the nuclear deal, the JCPOA that was signed in 2015. The point that is important is that the Americans have still not agreed to the requirements of the Iranians for the deal to go ahead, because the Iranians have said we want the full implementation of the deal. And so the Americans are still stonewalling on certain issues, and that has nothing to do with Russia.
What are these issues? What are these issues?
Well, since they're being discussed at the negotiating table, I don't want to speak too much about them, but it has to do with sanctions, it has to do with assurances and guarantees. There are different issues that still need to be resolved, and the Americans have not been constructive during the final days, nor the Europeans.
All right. Mr. Shah, still, let's look at the world today, not just 1 year ago, but today. Many suggest the geopolitical priorities and security priorities for the Europeans, particularly for the EU, might be shifting after this Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, we are seeing signs of that already. For example, the German increased their military budget to 2% of the national GDP, unprecedented in their history since World War II. Now, Mr. Shah, how do you see the Europeans' willingness to get this deal at this point? And how is that diverting different interests between the Europeans and the Americans?
Well, it's extremely difficult at the moment because it is largely out of Europe's hands. As Professor Morandi said, there are bilateral US-Iran issues. And then, of course, there's the role of Russia. And the Russians have put forward a paper which outlines what the guarantees are that they would like from the United States. The US has verbally said that they're not willing to do anything, but a formal response is likely to also be given. At that point, Moscow has to decide whether they are willing to just continue with the deal as is and the assurances that are already in the text, or whether they will continue to stonewall and block this from moving forward. Like I said, it isn't just on Russia's shoulders at the moment, and that's also what Professor Morandi said. There are still some issues left to resolve. In terms of Europe's role, absolutely. You know, a lot of government bandwidth has been diverted across the pan-European space to trying to figure out how to make sure that the current war in Ukraine does not spill into a larger NATO-Russia conflict, for example. The future years ahead look very dire because we really need a good working relationship with Russia in order for there to be progress on all of those files.
I see.
So the JCPOA in a way right now is a sacrificial lamb or a sort of a symbol of whether or not we will be able to continue to cooperate between the West and Russia on very, very vital nuclear issues.
Well said to both of you. Mr. Yang, listening to your two counterparts, how is China standing here? I know China is standing in what some of the Western media call tricky place, in this issue about Russia and Ukraine. But where is China standing now on the issue of the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I think that current position, China's position on Iran and those China's position on Ukraine crisis are totally different, simply because the nature of the two issues are totally different. Therefore, if even if someone say China is in a very backward or tricky position on the Ukraine crisis, however, China's position on Iran nuclear issue remain very clear and consistent. Simply saying, now the so-called pause is a sad story for everyone. We hate to see the pause. We like to see the progresses on the nuclear issue of Iran, so that we can strike a deal to revive the JCPOA. However, because of the effects from the Ukraine crisis, now there's some the so-called external factors affecting the progress on the nuclear issue of Iran. But China's position is, we need to separate the nuclear issue of Iran from the crisis on Ukraine. Therefore, it will be easier and simpler to solve the nuclear issue of Iran than now. So that is the way of thinking and the position of China.
Yang Xiyu, Sahil Shah, Mohammad Morandi, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it.